Okay, let's dive right in. I'd like to introduce Dr. Elena Gonzales. Elena is a scholar and curator and the author of Exhibitions for Social Justice from Routledge's Museum Meeting Series 2019. Dr. Gonzales grew up in a bicultural Mexican and Polish American family and began her curatorial career at the National Museum of Mexican Art. Most recently, she led exhibitions, the exhibitions committee at the Evanston Arts Center, where she participated in developing an annual schedule of more than 20 exhibitions per year and was proud to help launch a biannual curatorial fellowship for Black, Indigenous, and people of color curators. Gonzales speaks, publishes, and consults widely on the subjects of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, social justice in museums, sharing authority, inspiring action, and making museums worthy of the public trust they enjoy, all of which are crucial to her curatorial philosophy. So without further ado, I pass the mic to you, Elena.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? All right. First of all, I want to say thank you to the whole membership team for inviting me this evening and to all of the members for joining us. And thank you, of course, for being members of the Chicago History Museum. I'm going to share my screen so you can all see my presentation. Here I go. So what I'm going to do with our time this evening is I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and then a little bit about curatorial work in general, because we live in a time where that word is really being bandied about a lot. Curated news feeds, curated podcasts, curated menus, curated closets. And so we're going to get a little more specific to museum work. And then I'll talk specifically about the project that I'm working on right now, which is the Chicago Latino project here at the History Museum, where I'm a guest curator. So as Eric was saying in my introduction, I started out my curatorial journey, you might say, at the National Museum of Mexican Art here in Pilsen, where I worked on a project called the African Presence in Mexico. And through my work on that project, I was given the task of curating an exhibition called Who Are We Now? Roots, Resistance, and Recognition. And I'm showing the image on the right because that's a woodcut by Elizabeth Catlett called I Have Given the World My Songs, which was the tag image for my show, which was all about the relationships between African Americans and Mexicans in the United States and between African Americans and the country of Mexico. And that's sort of where I really got started doing curatorial work for social justice. So lots of time went by, lots more curatorial work and writing went by, and I came out with this book, Exhibitions for Social Justice, which looks at the way that we can use the space inside the gallery to work for the equitable distribution of risks and rewards in society. And in particular, I'm looking at the ways that we can parlay empathy into solidarity, build strong, long-lasting memories for visitors, and inspire visitors to take action, be it before, during, or after, or even long after the visit. And then finally, how we deal with our institutions. How do we make them more inclusive, more welcoming, share authority, and so forth. So when I was working on that project, I wrote about more than 20 institutions and I interviewed roughly 80 museum professionals all across the Americas and Europe. And these are just a few of the institutions that I worked on. And tonight, we're going to delve a little more deeply into this notion of curatorial work. So curate comes from the Latin word curare, which has many meanings, and I'm going to briefly relate them to this project. The first one is one of my favorites, to care for. Now, this kind of may make inherent sense in a museum context because we think about places like the conservation lab at the Chicago History Museum, where objects are cared for in great detail by trained professionals. But care can mean a lot of other things, and I'm going to dig deeper into that in a few minutes. Curate also means to undertake. And when I hear that word, I'm thinking launch, start, maybe start something big. I found this image of the former Mayor Jane Byrne throwing the pitch to the Puerto Rican Summer Softball League in 1985. And this is sort of where we are now with the Chicago Latino Project. We're just barely thrown out that first pitch. Curate also means to provide for. And this is an interesting word because it can mean literally providing for people in terms of sustenance, as the young street festival outside the Armitage Methodist Church in 1969. And it can mean just making it possible for things to happen. So you all as members will know this very well. In a museum setting, that means funding, that means putting the right staff in place, getting the right partners on board. There's all sorts of provisions that need to be in place for us to do curatorial work. Also, we have this meaning procure, which to me immediately makes me think of collections, which is a very important part of this project that I'm working on. Here, I've just got a couple of cheeky images for you. On the left, Edwin C. Arthur with a collection of moonshine containers that were taken during a raid on the South Side in 1922. And then on the right, Richard Nickel, a historic preservationist with a collection of his architectural ornaments by Louis Sullivan in 1960. I put these up because I can't yet show you the collections that I've collected for this project because we're just at the beginning, but it's important to understand that although the History Museum has voluminous collections, it's not yet well representing the Latino third of the city. And that is a big part of the undertaking here. And then finally, last but not least, there's this meaning to attend to, which to me, I hear witnessing, right? Here we are looking at a photograph of Barack Obama on election night in 2008 in Grant Park with all of these spectators witnessing his speech, attending to his speech, paying attention to his speech, okay? And for us as curators, one of our jobs is to witness the stories that fall under the topic area of the exhibition and to hear them, to pay attention to them, to pay attention to the storytellers, and to then help the public, that's you, to witness them as well. So these thoughts are all swirling around in my mind. I want to also maybe dispel some common myths about curatorial work. This portrait, which is a self-portrait by Charles Wilson Peale from 1822 of the artist in his museum, is a great example, a great detailed look at one sort of common stereotype about curatorial work. Curatorial work is done by an older white man who is of a certain class. In this instance, he's welcoming the visitor to his cabinet of curiosities, which I might add, Wilson Peale's museum was the first museum in the United States. It was located in Independence Hall at the Pennsylvania Academy. So he's welcoming the visitor to his worldview where he will beneficently educate the visiting public. And you can see there in the background, it includes families with children. He will educate people in this worldview, and they will be, it will be their great benefit to take in this education. But this is not the only way to look at curatorial work, and it's not the only old-fashioned way to look at curatorial work. So curatorial work for social justice is also very old-fashioned. And if we look at Hampton University Museum, founded in 1868, you know, historically Black university, it is well known for its collection of African-American it's well known for its African-American collections and AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander collections. And it is a space that's been doing this work ever since just a generation after Peale. And just another one quick example from history as well, W.E.B. Du Bois is well known as the curator of the Negro exhibit in the World's Fair in Paris in 1900. And this was an exhibition of 500 photographs that he selected and curated to tell a specific story of how deserving African Americans were of full inclusion in society due to education, class, scholarship, business ownership, all sorts of things that were associated in that moment with civic engagement and civic participation. And there are critiques, to be sure, of that approach that he took, but I definitely think it's an early example of curatorial work for social justice in his time. So in essence, to boil it down very, very simply and oversimplify it, we have two models of curatorial work. On the one hand, this sort of beneficent educator's voice, which maybe maintains and bolsters the existing social order and in which objects are the most important. And on the other hand, this first voice example in which the work is by, for, and about a given group of people. The goal is social justice or inclusion, and people are the most important. And I'm not saying at all that there's nothing in between. There are absolutely very many manifestations of this, but I wanted to bring up that distinction between objects and people, because as a curator, I mean, who are we kidding? I got into this business because I love objects. I adore objects. And I put up this image of Do Museums Still Need Objects, which is a book by Stephen Kahn from 2010, to say, you know, people have been talking about this divide between people and objects for a very long time. And, you know, spoiler alert in terms of his book, but he lands on the fact that museums love objects, we want objects, we need objects, but as my mama used to say, people are more important than things. So we really need to pay attention to what's most important in the curatorial instance. So what does this all have to do with Chicago History Museum? As members, you are probably familiar with the central exhibition at CHM, Chicago Crossroads of America, which opened 15 years ago. And I'm going to tell you a little story about it. So there was a group of students from Rudy Lozano High School in Pilsen that came to the museum on just a regular history field trip with their history teacher back in 2019. And they didn't really find anything about the Latino third of the city in this central exhibition, and indeed in the museum. And I'm just going to briefly show you what they did find. This is very brief. Here are the items inside of Crossroads that pertain. On the upper left, there's a photo reproduction of La Tapatia, Panaderia, and Carniceria. And the interesting thing to me about this moment is that the label actually is talking about a white neighborhood and change in the white neighborhood. So there's nothing about what is this shop, who are the people who shop there. There's nothing about the establishment or the so-called newcomers to the neighborhood. On the upper right, this is a case that's essentially being used to say that Chicago is a global city. And there are people from all over in Chicago, which is certainly true. In the case, we find a lot of different objects that are not really related to one another, and nor are they really interpreted in any detail. And on where you see my red arrow, you can see I'm pointed to two little Day of the Dead figurines in there. One is a couple, and one is a gentleman wearing a sombrero driving a carriage. And again, they're not really interpreted. There is a label next to them that says that at that moment, a quarter of the population in the city was Mexican. So that's interesting. On the lower left, I've zeroed in on a label within the sports section that just briefly mentions Ozzie Guillen being Venezuelan and being the former shortstop, and then manager of the White Sox in their winning World Series year in 2005. And then on the lower right, the object I sort of most love to hate is a souvenir from the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago in 1933 and 34. And it's actually an ashtray in the form of a sombrero, which is an interesting object that one might interpret if one had spent a lot of time laying the groundwork up front about this population, but to just come out with the ashtray at the end makes me feel sad. So just in case you're wondering what else was around the museum, I'll show you. On the left, you can see there's a wall on the first floor that many of you have seen called A New Life in America, where there are a lot of different immigrant families pictured, and one which I've circled is a Mexican family. In the middle, that's a shot from Facing Freedom. No doubt you will recall that Facing Freedom includes a story of United Farm Workers, and that's a picture of Dolores Huerta, but it doesn't really tell the Chicago story of United Farm Workers, which is sad, missed opportunity. And then on the lower right, there's a photograph of a paletero selling paletas on the beach. But the thing that is no longer there, and that the students did see on their visit, is this lowrider made by the Amistad Car Club of Cicero, which for many years was parked right in the front entryway, and you've no doubt seen it. So while there was a Chicago story behind this car, it was not contextualized very well. And the students certainly perceived it as being a moment where a sort of LA stereotype, the lowrider is from LA and it really harkens to LA car culture, where this LA stereotype was being applied to Chicagoans in a way that wasn't appropriate. And moreover, the biggest thing in the museum that was most prominent was in fact something that didn't feel like it had much to do with Chicago. Now, in fact, Pedro Cisneros, who was the founder of the Amistad Car Club, was commissioned by CHM to make this car, and he was a transplant from LA, and he actually was missing his LA people and started this car club here to kind of get a taste of home. So there is that LA connection as well, but the students were not getting that. So having had that whole experience, they protested the museum, and they went to social media, and they went to the news media, and they demanded change, and they demanded an exhibition that actually did address this population. And I'll just very briefly share a couple of their words with you because they're kind of important to me at this point. Isabel Quiroz says, personally, not seeing my ancestors made me believe that my people were not part of history at all. Oops, I touched something and now I can't go forward. Alfonso de Gante Jr. said, the harm that not knowing my own culture has done is it makes me look dumb when people ask me questions about it. It makes me look dumb and lost. It makes me think that the person asking is thinking, wow, this kid is dumb. Jonathan Gutierrez Custodio says, in my mind, I've always thought I couldn't do anything great because I've never seen my own people doing big things like the white people. Every time I see on TV, nothing but whites, and I wanted to be like them, forgetting where I came from and even stopping myself from talking Spanish. These comments are excerpts from the students' letters to the Chicago History Museum, and I really just carry them in my vest pocket throughout all of my days working on this project, because I feel that we do have a responsibility to these students and the many students like them all across the area. And in particular, this point in the middle comment about the gentleman thinking that other people are thinking, wow, this kid is dumb. I have little kids, and that one in particular, I'm thinking, this kid has a right not to feel that way. So these are a couple of my colleagues, not at the History Museum, but just in general. On the left, Mike Morawski, and on the right, Latanya Autry. And they're wearing a shirt that they designed that became very popular that says, museums are not neutral. So what that means is they are pointing out and asking everyone to acknowledge that museum exhibitions like newspaper articles, books, movies, and other products made by humans didn't magically spring into existence, but they carry with them the agency and the positionality of their creators, in this instance of curators. And that's important because museums have a special place in our informational environment. Everyone carries with them what we might call an informational environment, which is basically your understanding of the world right now. And it's influenced by all these different things, friends and family, museums, social media, movies, etc. And the thing about it is that studies show that museums are among the most trusted sources of information in the United States. Either they're neck and neck with friends and family, or they're right below friends and family. And that leaves us with a specific responsibility because what we do affects how people form their opinions and take action. So with that, I'm just going to introduce the project that I'm working on with it, which is the Chicago Latino Project, working title, planning to open in fall of 2025. And it's inspired by the resistance of the students from Rudy Lozano, and it will explore more than a century of Latino resistance to white supremacy and colonialism in Chicago, including histories, challenges, cultural expressions, and resilience of this very diverse population. So I'm going to go through a few ideas about care as they relate to this show. Types of care. First of all, I view us as caring for people. Who are these people, right? I keep talking about this Latino Latinx third of the city. Well, if we look at this lovely map from the UIC Great Cities Institute, we can see that population distributed around the city. Some neighborhoods are 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% Latino. Some are not. Some are 20%, 10%, but this is a very significant part of Chicago. And not only Chicago, but also the suburbs. Okay, so if we look at Chicagoland, Cicero, Berwyn, Aurora, Elgin, Waukegan are, also 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% Latino. And so that's quite significant. And this is the people who I'm hoping will feel just a little more cared for as a result of the work we're doing now. And I'll introduce you to some of the people who are helping me with that endeavor. This is our community advisory committee that's helping us with all aspects of, they're giving us feedback on all aspects of the entire project. From the upper left going counterclockwise, that's Eduardo Arrocho, the head of Paseo Boricua Tours in Humboldt Park. If you ever need an amazing tour of the Humboldt Park murals, he's your man. Deborah Cantor, author of Chicago Católico. Mirna Garcia, a scholar at Northwestern. Esther Trujillo, a scholar at DePaul. Vanessa Sanchez, the director of education at the National Museum of Mexican Art. Antonio Ramirez, the founder and director of the Chicagolandia Oral History Project, which focuses on the suburbs. Antonio Santos, the founder and director of the Gage Park Latinx Council. Rosa Cabrera, the director of UIC's Latino Center. Nicole Marroquin, an artist and professor at School of the Art Institute, and Ernesto Sandoval, who was a principal in CPS and now is in Lake Forest. We are utterly indebted to this entire group, and I put this list up because there's a few people who I couldn't get headshots for. Maria Drell at the Brazilian Cultural Center, Rafael Nunez at Dama, and Fanny Cano at Mujeres Latinas en Acción. And so then there's caring for communities. Community is a very dangerous, very overused word. And I'm just gonna put up some ways in which communities are constituted. We need to be careful that we're not using the word community as a cover or a euphemism for just people of color, right? Community, everyone has communities. Everyone's in different communities. And I like to put this slide up to both introduce the term intersectionality, which is the way in which all of our different communities come together to make each one of us as individuals, and also to show that complexity, right? So I say this is a little snapshot of some of my identities, but not all of them. Every time I put it up, I want to add things to it. So when we're talking about communities in terms of this project, we're talking about 20 plus countries of origin or heritage, 25 plus neighborhoods and suburbs. That is a lot of spots, by the way, just a lot. Youth organizations like Yolocali Arts Reach, the after-school initiative of the National Museum of Mexican Art, or Rudy Lozano High School. Collaborative groups, like for example, the activists who are working together to stop General Iron from opening a metal shredding facility on the southeast side of their neighborhood. Communities of worship, like the parishioners of St. Francis of Assisi Church, who don't live around the parish, but they're still a community. They're not a geographic community. Co-workers, so many different people who are in this Latino population came to Chicago, or their ancestors came to Chicago for work. And so these communities of coworkers are important as well. This is Pascuala Martinez and her badge from Illinois Steel, which I'm showing with the kind permission of the Southeast Chicago Historical Society. So we have a second group of partners that is a growing group that's meant to look at the big picture of this project and connect us to all kinds of groups all around the city so that we don't lose that nuance. I told you I loved objects, so we're still talking about caring for objects here, but there's more to caring for objects than conservation. And I'll just quickly say thank you very much to the Illinois Arts Council for funding the interns who are working at the History Museum on this project right now. In this picture, we have Sammy Rivera and Jair Ramirez, who are our current interns. And in this picture, what we're doing is, in these pictures, what we're doing is interpreting the signs that the students made in their protest of Chicago History Museum. So part of caring for objects is actually caring for their context. What stories do they tell? Where do they come from? How are they used? What did their makers intend? All kinds of things like that. And in terms of caring for stories, there's also the question of stories that don't have a ready embodied nature inside of an object, right? So here we are again, Sami and Jair and Luis Tubens, who is there on the left. He is an expert on the murals in Pilsen. He's been giving tours there for decades. And the murals are his exhibition to teach from. They're his textbook. And they actually are like a textbook of community stories in the Pilsen neighborhood. And just as the Humboldt Park murals are there, or the Gage Park murals are there. And so one of our tasks here is to find ways of bringing those stories to you, to the public. And that might manifest itself in the short documentary film that Jair is working on, or in the labels that Sami is working on that might accompany photographs. So what are we doing next? The big number one task for me over the last almost a year, and frankly, in an ongoing way, is building relationships, building the musculature that connects the Chicago History Museum to this third of the city. And of course, building collections is going to be a part of that, because that is going to be a part of how we are able to bring the story to you. You might think that fall 2025 is far away, and it might be crossing your mind, why is there such a long run up to this show? And the answer is that constituting those relationships, building those collections, and building the infrastructure to do this right, and to not have the Chicago Latino exhibition be the end point, but rather to have it be the starting point of the museum's work with this third of the city. It really does take laying the groundwork properly. And so that's the short answer to that question. With that, I will say thank you so very much. And I am questions. And I'll just stop the sharing. Eric, are you there?
Yes, let me come on camera 1 second. One second, trying to get off of, turn on my video here, 1 second. Well, why don't I just start by asking some questions that folks had, and I want to remind participants here that you can post any questions in the Q&A box if you hit that on the bottom of your screen, and we'll read some of those. So why don't I start with the first question? So can you share any great resources for those of us interested in learning more about Latinos in Chicago?
Absolutely, thank you for that. So I think that's a really important thing for anybody who maybe isn't as familiar with this third of the city. And I'm gonna paste into the chat a short list of resources, including books, podcasts, online exhibitions, just all kinds of stuff, just in case people want a variety, news articles, in case people want a variety of resources, because there's so much good information out there. And it's great to start digging into it. And I'll particularly shout out that first one. Oh, thank you so much. I'll particularly shout out Making Mexican Chicago by Micah Mesqua, which is a brand new book that talks about the history of some of these neighborhoods. Let's see here.
Okay, and Elena, we have a question from a participant. Paul King is asking, I'm a contributor to the Chicago History Museum. Is there a program on African Americans?
So Paul, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because although this is sort of my specific area for right now, I do want to point out a couple of things that relate to your question. One of them is that although there are more references to African Americans within Crossroads than Latinos, this is also a group that is also a third of the city that has really been absent in a lot of the curatorial work that we've seen in terms of its size in the city, right? And that is something that the museum is working on addressing. And I think you'll be hearing more about that in the coming months. The other thing that I want to say is that I do believe there are a lot of public programs that fall into this area. And again, although that's not my specific area of expertise, if you send me your email address, I can both send you resources and I can put you in touch with people who know more than I do.
Okay, Elena, we have another question from Peg Siciliano. Have you or will you have specific outreach to get objects reflecting Latino culture or history, either donated to the museum or loaned for the exhibit?
Absolutely is the answer to that. And thank you so much for that question. Right now, we're working on developing a model for this that is not extractive. So what I mean is, we do not want to swoop in and take resources that should be going to a different sort of community-based organization. Like if there was an object that really belonged at the NMMA or that really belonged at the Puerto Rican Museum of the National Puerto Rican Museum, we would not want to swoop in and try to take that away. What we do want to do is make sure that things that are historically important are not moldering in someone's attic or basement when they could be preserved at CHM. So one thing that we're going to do, and we're in the process of this right now, I'm working closely with our director of collections, Julie Wroblewski, is we're working on organizing some workshops in communities, in different neighborhoods, different types of spaces, be they libraries or community centers, where we can talk about how the History Museum does collecting, get feedback about how people think that collecting should be done, and ultimately run some of these workshops like talking about, where we can do some collecting, bring in some objects, and also help people with History Museum resources to learn more about how to care for their own collections if there are things that they're still enjoying in their families and wanting to keep safe.
Yeah, I had the next question, Elena, is I hear you've been using Latino versus a term more recently, Latinx. Can you say why you use one over the other, or which is appropriate use in varying situations? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And to be totally honest, I use Latino tonight out of simplicity, but mostly when I talk, I usually say Latino, Latinx. I usually say them both. And it's a little bit of a linguistic drag right now. I'm certainly writing them both. I actually, when I write them, if you saw at one point in my presentation, it said Latino AX. So I do that in writing. And then when I'm speaking, I say Latino, Latinx. As our director of communications, Tema, would say, the conversation in the communities about these terms is live. This is an ongoing debate right now around the country and around the city. And there are a couple of ways to think about it. Of course, I think many people know that the X is designed to be more inclusive from a gender and sexuality standpoint for those who may not conform to a binary. And of course, Spanish is a Romance language that uses a masculine gender to refer to everyone, and that doesn't feel great for everyone. So I really want that inclusivity. However, I also am sensitive to the fact that Latinx doesn't, I see, please provide, my email address is in my original chat at the very bottom. Latinx doesn't roll off the tongue in Spanish. Although I've heard people say, you know, well, the X is very important in Mesoamerican languages. Okay, so that's cool. But I think broadly speaking, there's a little bit of a generational divide between folks who came up under the banner of Latino, right? An older generation who feels like a little more comfortable with that word, even though it flattens out a lot of differences, be they race, class, country of origin. And then there's a younger generation who feels like it embraces this Latinx term. And maybe that's because more of the younger folks didn't grow up only speaking Spanish, or maybe it's just because there's a very strong solidarity in that generation with wanting to be inclusive toward non-binary folks. But I would say, if you really want to cover your bases, OAX or OAX.
Elena, we had another question. How can members support this project?
Oh, well, there are many opportunities for members to support this project. And first of all, I'm just grateful for you being here tonight. That's like step one. I'm gonna break it down into three main areas, although I think there's no doubt more to be said. First of all, financial support, right? There is no way for this project to go forward at the level and with the scope that I would like to see and that all of the participants would like to see without financial support. So that's very important. But then also, like, the resources that I put up, learning about this third of the city, and in case you happen not to be Latino or X yourself, being a great ally, right? Showing up and saying, yes, I see you, not marginalizing people, not judging people based on language or documentation status, not spreading misinformation, just being a great neighbor, right? And then lastly, but no less importantly, sharing connections to stories and collections. Maybe you know someone, or you know someone who knows someone, or you are someone who has a fantastic story to tell that involves this third of the population, or a fantastic object that talks about this third of the population in some way. Email me, because that's great news.
And so I'll just note that Elena's email address is in the chat there. If folks want to email Elena, they're encouraged to. And then one more question. And folks, anyone else who wants to put questions, you can put it in the Q&A or in the chat. Actually, maybe a couple more questions. Let's start with this one. Were members of the Afro-Latinx community part of the development of the upcoming exhibit?
That's another fantastic question, and thank you for that. So for those of you who were listening from the beginning, you will know that the Afro-Latinx, or in my personal case, like Afro-Mexican history, is very near and dear to my heart, because I worked on the African Presence in Mexico project at the NMMA long ago. And in a nutshell, the answer to that is we are not done establishing the partners for this project by any means yet. We are still looking for partners who can better represent that population. However, we are already looking at stories that involve that population, and we're already talking a lot about Puerto Rico and the Caribbean in ways that don't leave out the subject of race. And I think the thing that I would rather say is, Afro-Latino is one thing, but also just talking about race is another thing. And so that's something that our committee is very, very committed to, and I'm very committed to. And so I think you will see that presence growing within the project.
Elena, we have another question. What are you most looking forward to in this project?
Well, I am very excited about many parts of this project, and I'm very nervous about many parts of this project, if we're being completely honest, which I always am. So I'm going to just share a couple. In the short term, I'm very excited to see the research contributions of our interns and young people who are working in the project. And I'm very excited to continue the work that I was describing about bringing in new collections to the History Museum, because ultimately those are both ways that we're going to get greater access to telling a lot of these stories, especially even telling them beyond the scope of the exhibition. So like one participant this evening asked about loans. We hope to borrow a number of things from a number of different organizations, and that's fabulous. And our lending partners we're very grateful for, and I'm sure individuals will lend us things as well. But at the end of the day, we also need to have a plan going forward, and that's going to be part of what I'm excited to build. The other thing that I'm excited about is a little more long-term, so you'll have to bear with me on that. But I hope that you'll share my vision once I tell it to you. So right now, the History Museum is in a place where folks in Pilsen, Little Village, Gage Park, a lot of Latino, Latinx neighborhoods don't know about the History Museum, or if by some chance they do, they probably don't have a favorable perception of it. And that's because there's a lot of work to do. And so I have a very fond hope that we'll go through the process of opening this exhibition. We'll go through some more big changes at the History Museum over the course of years. And maybe in a decade, we will be in a position where the History Museum will advertise for some exhibition or some program that may or may not be directly related to Latinos, but like all things at the History Museum, should have some relationship to that third of the population. And, they'll advertise for something, and somebody in Pilsen or Little Village or Gage Park or Waukegan or Elgin will see that and they'll say, oh, Chicago History Museum. I have a good feeling about this organization. I think this organization is really doing great work, and I'd love to go check that out. So that's what I'm excited about.
Okay, on that note, I would just like to, first of all, thank everyone for joining us tonight. This was really great to have lots of great questions and participation. These are meant to be interactive panels. And thank everyone. We've had an in-person member night at the Chicago History Museum yesterday. A lot of people, and we had our virtual member night tonight. We've had a lot of programs to the last program of the evening. So just want to thank everyone for joining us, and just encourage you to participate, invite your friends. But I especially like to thank Elena. Thanks, Elena, for this presentation. It was really beautifully done presentation. So thank you so much for all your preparation and really interesting information.
Thank you so much. And that's so kind of you to say. It's been a pleasure to be with you all this evening. And I just want to say thank you again for being members of the History Museum. We really appreciate your support, and we're delighted to have you.
All right, on that note, we're going to sign off, and thanks again, folks. Have a great night.